the year 885, Paris should have died quickly. 30,000 Vikings surrounded it. 700 longships sealed the river. By every rule of war, this city was already dead. But Paris did not fall. It starved. It burned. It endured. And in the end, the Vikings won anyway. Paris was not a capital yet. It was not an empire. It was not even important. It was an island, a hard knot of stone and wood, trapped between cold currents, sitting in the river like a lock on a door. To the Franks, it was a city. To the Vikings, it was an obstacle. And obstacles existed to be removed. Winter came early that year. The river darkened. The air sharpened. Then the sails appeared. Not dozens, not hundreds. A horizon, wood, iron, canvas, shadows moving against the sky. Viking longships slid upriver in silence, their prows carved into beasts and gods, their hulls riding low, heavy with men who did not come to ask questions. This was not a raid. Raids were fast. Raids were precise. Raids struck and vanished like knives in the dark. This was something else. This was weight. This was pressure. The Vikings did not come to take Paris. They came to pass through it. Beyond the city lay richer lands, softer targets, unprotected monasteries and valleys full of grain. Paris was simply in the way, so the Vikings demanded permission, open the river, lower the bridges, let the fleet pass. Paris said no, and that single word turned a passage into a siege. The river closed. 700 longships spread across the water, blocking sunlight, blocking trade, blocking escape. The sound of oars never stopped. The creak of wood became constant. The city listened as the river itself was occupied. Inside Paris, there were no grand armies, no emperor, no relief force on the horizon, only walls, only bridges, only people who understood one thing. If the river opened, Paris would cease to exist. The Vikings attacked the bridges first. They built towers of wood and rope, rolling them forward inch by inch, under arrow fire, under boiling oil, under stones dropped by desperate hands. Fire followed. Flames climbed the bridge supports. Smoke rolled through the streets. Ash fell like snow. Paris answered with endurance. Every assault was repelled. Every breach was sealed with bodies. Men fought not for glory, but for time. Days became weeks. Weeks turned into months, and the siege changed shape. The Vikings could not break the city, so they decided to let it rot. Food disappeared first. Grain stores emptied. Animals vanished from the streets. The river that once fed Paris now strangled it. Disease followed hunger, then fire, then silence. People did not die screaming in battle. They died quietly in doorways, in churches, in rooms with nothing left to burn. Still, Paris did not surrender, because surrender was no longer the question. The question was, would anyone come? Winter passed, spring arrived, summer burned, and finally banners appeared on the horizon. The emperor had come. The city waited for salvation. The Vikings waited for battle. Neither arrived. There was no great clash, no heroic charge, no river red with blood. Instead, silver changed hands. The emperor paid. He did not break the siege. He did not save the countryside. He bought the Vikings away and sent them to raid someone else. The river opened, the longships moved on. Paris survived. But something else died that day. The belief that cities would be protected. The belief that endurance would be rewarded. The belief that power meant responsibility. The Vikings had not taken Paris. They had taken something far more valuable. They proved that an empire could be defeated without conquering a single wall. And Europe was never the same. History tells us that cities fall when they are outnumbered. Paris should have collapsed the moment the Vikings arrived. It did not, because Paris was not defended by armies. It was defended by refusal. Two men stood between the river and the empire. Not kings, not emperors. Two men history nearly erased. Odo of Paris, a young count with more resolve than soldiers, more stubbornness than steel. And Goslin, a bishop who did not kneel and pray for rescue, but lifted armor onto his shoulders and picked up a weapon. Together, they commanded a few thousand defenders at most. Farmers, guards, citizens who had never expected to fight a war, against 30,000 Vikings. This should not have been bravery. It should have been suicide. Every law of warfare said Paris was finished. Every precedent agreed. But wars are not decided by numbers alone. They are decided by geometry. Paris had something the Vikings did not expect. A choke point. Two bridges, stone and timber stretched across the river, anchoring the city to the riverbanks like iron nails driven into flowing water. Destroy the bridges and Paris would bleed open. Hold them. And the greatest Viking fleet ever assembled would be trapped in place. The Vikings understood this immediately. So they attacked the bridges. Not cautiously, not patiently. They attacked with rage. Siege towers rolled forward, wooden giants creaking under their own weight, pushed by men who believed numbers guaranteed victory. Stones flew, not warning shots, not tests. Stones meant to crush walls, to break bones, to remind the defenders that resistance was pointless. Then came fire. Flames climbed the bridge supports, licking upward, turning night into daylight. Smoke poured into the city, burning eyes, burning lungs. This was the moment Paris was expected to break. Instead, Paris answered. Arrows darkened the sky. Boiling oil poured down like punishment. Men were shoved backward, screaming, falling into the river with armor dragging them under. The Seine swallowed them without ceremony. No speeches, no mercy. Just wait. Every Viking assault was met by bodies that refused to move. Not heroic bodies, exhausted bodies, starving bodies, but bodies that held. Hours became days. Days stretched into weeks. The Vikings attacked again, and again, and again. Each time the bridges still stood. The city behind them burned. Food vanished. Disease crept through narrow streets. But the river remained closed, and slowly something changed. The Vikings realized they were no longer fighting a city. They were fighting time. Every day spent here was a day not spent raiding. Every man lost on the bridges was a man who would never see home. The siege was supposed to be fast. It became heavy. The Vikings had not been defeated, but they had been delayed, and delay was dangerous, because delay gave Paris something invaluable. Proof. Proof that the Vikings could be resisted. Proof that endurance mattered. Proof that leadership was not about crowns, but about standing where retreat would be easier. Odo fought where the walls were weakest. Goslin fought where men were dying, one with command, one with faith turned into iron. They did not promise victory, they promised refusal, and that refusal held the river shut for weeks, then months. By the time the Vikings understood that Paris would not break quickly, the siege had already changed the future of Europe. Not because of who won, but because of who refused to lose. Paris was not destroyed by blades. It was destroyed by waiting. This siege did not kill Paris quickly. It killed it slowly, not with screams, but with silence. Food vanished first, not suddenly, not dramatically. One day the markets were smaller, the next empty. Animals disappeared from the streets. Horses, dogs, anything that could be eaten. Grain stores were opened, then scraped, then guarded like treasure. The city learned a new mathematics. How many mouths, how many days, how much time remained. The river that once fed Paris now delivered death. It no longer brought fish and trade. It brought the sight of longships, the sound of oars, the knowledge that escape was impossible. Every glance at the water was a reminder. You are surrounded. Disease followed hunger. It crept through narrow streets where sunlight barely reached. Fever spread from house to house, from family to family. There were no doctors, only guesses, only prayers. Bodies were carried out at dawn, quietly so the living would not see how many had died overnight. Fire came next, not from Viking torches, but from within. Cooking fires left unattended. Workshops overheating, homes too crowded to breathe. Flames leapt between buildings faster than men could run. There were no resources to stop them. Paris burned itself. People did not die in battle. They did not fall gloriously on walls. They died sitting down. They died lying still. They died unnoticed. The city did not scream. It endured. And that endurance became its curse. Because surrender was not the question. Everyone already knew what surrender meant. Open the bridges, open the river, erase the city. No. The real question whispered itself through empty streets and dark rooms. Would anyone come? Every morning, eyes turned outward, toward the roads, toward the riverbanks, toward the horizon. Every morning, nothing. Weeks passed, then months. The defenders were still on the walls. Thinner, slower, quieter. The Vikings were still on the river, waiting, patient, watching. They did not need to attack. Paris was doing the work for them. This was not warfare. This was pressure. This was a test of endurance with no visible enemy. Parents stopped explaining things to children. Leaders stopped making promises. Hope became dangerous, because hope delayed acceptance, and acceptance looked too much like surrender. Still, Paris did not open its gates, because as long as the gates were closed, the story was not over. As long as the bridges stood, the river was denied. As long as someone remained on the walls, Paris existed. Even in decay, even in silence, even in hunger. The city held on not because it believed it would be saved, but because letting go meant admitting it never mattered. And somewhere beyond the river, beyond the smoke, beyond the patience of the Vikings, the question remained unanswered. Would anyone come? For a year, Paris waited to be saved. And then, salvation finally arrived. At last, someone came. Not a messenger, not a rumor. The emperor himself, Charles the Fat, an emperor with banners snapping in the wind, with titles inherited from legends, with an army large enough to end the siege in days. Paris saw the standards on the horizon and dared to believe. The defenders straightened on the walls. The starving lifted their heads. After a year of hunger, fire, and death, authority had arrived. The Vikings saw him too. They did not panic. They did not retreat. They waited. Because now the siege was no longer about Paris. It was about power. History held its breath. This was the moment songs are written about. The clash of kings. The rescue at the last possible second. But no battle came. Charles did not attack. He did not test the Viking lines. He did not break the siege towers. He did not charge the river. Instead, he negotiated. No, he paid. Not negotiated peace, purchased peace. Silver was brought out. Wealth gathered from a suffering land was handed to the men who had caused that suffering. And then came the decision that shattered everything Paris believed in. Charles allowed the Vikings to pass. Not through Paris, past it, down the river, free to raid Burgundy instead. The bridges that had held for a year were opened by command, not by force. Paris had survived a year of hell, only to be bypassed by authority. This was not mercy. This was calculation. The emperor chose stability over justice, convenience over courage, distance over responsibility. Paris was spared, but not defended. The Vikings did not need to win the city. They had exposed something far more valuable. They had revealed the truth that cities already suspected, but had never seen so clearly. That emperors would not always fight. That loyalty was conditional. That suffering could be negotiated away if it became inconvenient enough. The Vikings left richer than they arrived. But silver was not their greatest prize. They took certainty. They proved that an empire could be bent without breaking a single wall. That fear could accomplish what violence could not. And Paris learned a lesson more painful than hunger. It learned that endurance does not guarantee protection. That holding the line does not mean someone will stand with you. The defenders had fought for a year believing rescue was coming. It had come, and chosen not to fight. Charles the Fat returned with his army intact. But his authority did not survive the journey. Because power that refuses to defend reveals itself as hollow. The siege ended, but the damage spread outward. Nobles across the realm took note. Cities remembered. And men like Odo of Paris understood something fundamental. If emperors would not protect the land, then someone else would have to. Paris stood, but belief collapsed. And once belief is gone, empires do not fall suddenly. They leak, slowly, silently, until nothing remains but names and books. The Vikings sailed away without conquering Paris. They did not need to. They had already won. The Vikings did not leave Paris in triumph. They left without conquering a single wall. And yet, this was their greatest victory. The Vikings sailed away richer than they arrived. Their ships were heavier with silver, with tribute, with wealth taken not by force, but by agreement. But silver was not what made this siege legendary. They took something far more dangerous. They took certainty. They proved a truth Europe had never been forced to face. Walls could hold, cities could endure, but empires could break without a fight. Paris learned it was alone, not surrounded by enemies, but abandoned by authority. For a year, the city had resisted hunger, fire, and death, believing endurance would be rewarded. It was not. The nobles learned something worse. They learned the emperor would not save them, not because he could not, but because he chose not to. Protection, they realized, was conditional. Loyalty was negotiable. Suffering could be calculated. And once that lesson was learned, the old world began to crack. Men like Odo of Paris understood this immediately. Odo had not waited for permission to defend Paris. He had not waited for imperial orders. He stood on the walls because no one else would. And in that act, he discovered a new definition of power. Power did not come from crowns. It did not come from ancestry. It came from presence. If you defend your people, you do not need permission to rule them. That idea spread faster than any Viking fleet. Across the Frankish lands, counts and lords watched the siege carefully. They saw Paris hold. They saw the emperor hesitate. They saw silver replace steel. And they adjusted. Why rely on distant rulers who might bargain away your survival? Why wait for help that might never come? Local power strengthened. Central authority weakened. The Vikings did not need to destroy the Carolingian world. They rearranged it. Years later, Odo would become king. Not because he was chosen by an emperor, but because people remembered who stood with them when it mattered. And Charles the Fat? He would be deposed, not defeated in battle, not assassinated, simply removed. Because authority that refuses to act cannot survive scrutiny. The Carolingian Empire did not collapse in flames. It fractured, quietly, legally, irreversibly. All because a Viking army proved that leverage was stronger than conquest. They did not need to occupy Paris. They did not need to massacre its people. They only needed to force the empire to reveal itself. And once revealed, once everyone saw that power would negotiate instead of defend, the illusion was gone. This is why the Vikings won. Not because they took land, but because they changed how power was understood. After Paris, every city questioned its ruler. Every noble measured loyalty against survival. The siege ended, but the aftershock spread across Europe, and long after the silver was spent, long after the ships disappeared downriver, the lesson remained. Empires do not fall when their walls are breached. They fall when their people stop believing they will be protected. Paris stood, but the world around it was already breaking, and the Vikings, without conquering a city, had conquered the future. This siege did not end with victory. It ended with a receipt. History expects wars to finish with smoke and silence, with broken walls, with bodies in the streets. Paris offered something different. This siege did not end with conquest. It ended with a transaction. Silver changed hands. Orders were signed. The river opened, and that is what made it dangerous. Because violence can be answered with walls, but transactions rewrite reality. The Vikings did not tear Paris apart. They let it stand, hungry, burned, exhausted, standing, and in doing so, they taught Europe a lesson it would never forget. You do not need to destroy a system to defeat it. You only need to prove that it will abandon its own people when the cost becomes inconvenient. Paris burned, but authority burned faster. For a year, the city endured believing that suffering had meaning, that endurance would be rewarded, that loyalty would be answered, that power existed to protect. When the siege ended, those beliefs did not survive. Paris learned that walls could save lives, but not trust. That courage could delay death, but not guarantee loyalty. The real damage was invisible. It spread quietly from city to city, from noble to noble. If Paris could be bargained away, so could anyone else. If an emperor could pay instead of fight, then power was not strength. It was calculation. From that moment on, Europe looked different. Cities did not just build walls. They built independence. Nobles did not just swear loyalty. They prepared alternatives. The center weakened not because it was attacked, but because it was revealed. This is why the siege mattered. Not because Paris nearly fell, but because it learned it was alone. And once a people understand that truth, they never forget it. Closing. What really fell in 885 narrator, measured final. Paris did not fall in the year 885. Its walls held, its bridges stood, its name survived. But something else collapsed. The belief that kings would protect cities. The belief that empires were permanent. The belief that power was strong simply because it existed. The Vikings did not conquer Paris. They conquered the idea that it could rely on anyone else. They proved that fear could travel faster than armies. That leverage could achieve more than blood. That belief was the most fragile structure of all. When the longships left the river, they carried silver. But they left behind doubt, and doubt spreads. It spreads into councils and courts, into decisions made at night, into the quiet realization that survival might require standing alone. From that moment forward, Europe changed how it defended itself. Not with faith in emperors but with preparation. Not with trust, but with caution. Paris stood. But the world it belonged to was already ending. Because empires do not fall when their enemies are strong. They fall when their people stop believing they will be defended. The siege of Paris was not a victory, it was a revelation. And once revealed, history does not go back.